Boker Tov. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you who are in other parts of the world. Welcome to our first ever CJP Global Jewish Citizenship Summit. My name is Marc Baker. I'm the president and CEO of Combined Jewish Philanthropies, and I'm so excited to be with all of you today. First of all, thank you to the incredibly impressive lineup of guest speakers and presenters who are going to be joining us and inspiring us over these next few days. I want to thank my CJP colleagues, both here in Boston and in Haifa, including the fabulous Rachel Granberg-Weinstein and our talented Israel and Global Jewish Citizenship IGJC team, who have worked so hard to make this event happen. Thank you to Boston Haifa Director Ariel Liebhaber and to Associate Vice President of IGJC at CJP, Aviva Klompus, who had the vision and imagination to create this summit. I'm sorry that Aviva won't be able to join us for the meetings this week, but I know her leadership will be felt throughout. And a special thank you to our Boston Haifa and IGJC chairs and volunteers, especially co-chairs Lisa Wallach, David Fine, and Gadi Ziv. We could not do this work without all of you. And thank you to all of you who are with us today, who represent the diversity of our community of communities and of the Jewish people. We're joined by people from around the Jewish world, from Greater Boston, Haifa, and Dnipro, Ukraine, our three sister cities. You represent different generations, different ways of expressing Jewish identity, different political perspectives and points of view about the most important issues we're facing today, which is precisely the point of this summit. Now, many of you know that our Shutfut, the Boston-Haifa Partnership, has an annual tradition of what we call March meetings. These meetings, which are usually in person, are a highlight of our partnership. We plan for the year ahead. We see firsthand the impact of our investments. We get work done together. And most importantly, we connect with one another on a human level. You see, people-to-people relationships, caring for each other, and deepening our knowledge and understanding of one another are the foundations upon which we create a vibrant, thriving Jewish future together. And we sustain the thousands-year-old Jewish idea that Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lezeh, that all of Israel are indeed bound up together and collectively responsible for one another. Now this year, while we cannot be together in person, we're seizing the moment, not only to connect and plan virtually, but to open up these March meetings to our broader communities, to build in new dynamic learning sessions, and to engage in public conversations about the challenges and the opportunities that are going to define our future. Now, we all know the trends. So much has been written about the challenges we're facing. Obviously, the growing vulnerabilities of Jews and others around the world in the face of this horrible pandemic. The growing polarization and rifts between Israel and North American Jewry and within our own communities. The sense of disconnection that too many North American Jews, especially of our younger generation, feel from Israel and the Jewish people. These challenges are real and we need to talk about them as we will over the next few days, but they are not inevitable. The relationships we have built between Boston, Haifa, and Dnipro are a blueprint from which the Jewish world can learn. They're a tikkun, a repair. They are models for achdut, unity, and amiyut, peoplehood in the 21st century. The future is in our hands, and we have the power to shape it together. As we emerge from the holiday of Purim just last week and begin to prepare for Passover, which, believe it or not, is now less than a month away, I'm reminded of the way that Rabbi David Hartman describes Judaism in the context of his explanation of what it means for each of us to internalize the Exodus story and the idea that each of us were slaves in Egypt. Rabbi Hartman says this: Judaism is unique in that rather than beginning with a leap of faith, it demands a leap of identification with a people and its history, a leap of identification with a people and its history. That is what we at CJP mean by the concept of global Jewish citizenship. It's a deep sense of interconnectedness between Jews around the world and a sense of both privilege and responsibility that come with being part of the Jewish people. We are responsible for our global Jewish family, and as Jews on the world stage, we are also responsible for contributing to building a better world. We walk through that world as parts of a greater whole, inheritors of an extraordinary story and writers, creators of the next chapters. This summit reflects CJP's commitment to convening the right people, all of you, partners, volunteers, donors, community members, political leaders, entrepreneurs, visionaries from around the Jewish world, convening the right people to engage in the right conversations about where we've been and where we're going. Over the next few days, we'll talk about the past year and the extraordinary responses to a global pandemic. We'll discuss the relationship between Israel, North America, and Jews around the world. We'll talk about the changing dynamics of the Middle East. We'll hear from leaders of our most essential global partners about the critical work they're doing every day, about the impact our community is making, and about the transformative power of partnerships. We will learn, explore, and imagine together, and then we'll take these conversations and translate them into action. While we don't know exactly when we'll fully emerge from this crisis or what the new normal will look like, I can feel the spring coming. With more vaccines on the horizon, I am hopeful that positive change is on the way, and I can't wait to be all together in person again soon. In the meantime, we've got important work to do, so let's get to it. In just a few minutes, we'll hear words of greeting from our partner and the head of the Dnipro Jewish community, Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky. After his remarks, one of Boston's own visionaries and philanthropists, Shira Ruderman, will moderate today's keynote session. Shira is a global Jewish leader in her own right, who bridges worlds and challenges all of her partners to make a bigger difference. She's also a good friend. I'm so glad she's here with us this morning. Thanks, Shira. And before we welcome our speakers, please enjoy this short video about the history and the impact of the relationships we've created over the past 30 plus years. Thank you all again for being here.
Years ago, volunteers created the Boston-Haifa connection to strengthen the bond between Americans and Israelis, forming a living bridge between our two cities. Not long after, Boston partnered with Dnipro, the fourth largest city in Ukraine, to help revitalize Jewish life in the former Soviet Union. We soon realized how little physical distance matters in a community where people are deeply tied together. As global Jewish citizens, we can partner to change the world. Personal relationships, robust partnerships. That's what the Boston-Haifa connection is all about, bringing our communities closer together. Working side by side, we support vulnerable families in Haifa, connect young adults, and explore Jewish identities, address challenges, empower change makers, and embrace the future. Under Soviet rule, Jewish life was prohibited in Dnipro, a city without a rabbi for 52 years. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Jews began to revive their community. But they needed a partner. Working hand in hand with Ukrainian Jewish leaders and organizations, CJP and JCRC launched the Dnipropetrovsk Kihila project, now part of Global Caring. Today, Dnipro is home to the second largest Jewish community in Ukraine. This vibrant partnership supports day schools and community education programs, providing critical support for medical care, elder services, and resources for families, bringing a Jewish community back to life. Our connections span thousands of miles, transforming individuals from 3 continents and 3 countries into neighbors, partners, and friends. As global Jewish citizens, we stand hand in hand and heart to heart, ready to change the world. Together, we can create a better future.
Hello, Shalom Aleichem, from Ukraine, from the city of Dnipro. My name is Shmuel Kaminetsky. When we came, there was hardly a Jewish community. After 70 years of communism, they destroyed everything. 50 synagogues in the city were shut down. The community was shut down, and we had to start all over again from zero. And this is when Boston came into the picture, because what we needed was a strong partner with many proud Jews that care about Jews all over the world. So the first thing that you guys in Boston gave us, our partners in Boston, was when you came here, that local Jewish people saw that you can be Jewish and be proud of it. But we needed to build a community, a system, an organization, transparent, professional. And this is when Boston came into the picture. We went to Boston with our people. You came to us, and slowly by slowly, we established a very organized community. And if we look at the institutions that we established with you, we were the first community that started an old age home for the elderly people. We also have a hospital here. It's called Jewish Medical Center. And the CJP is so connected to the medical community. So we were, from the beginning, doing many medical projects to help people with the Ribakov family, for the women, for the children, and immunization, and hip replacement. Thousands of people started walking again. Some of the treatments we are able to provide thanks to the equipment that you gave us. It's a real miracle going on here. And I want to tell you, it says, Kol Yisrael Arivim Ze Lazeh. We need to care about each other. This is like the biggest example of Kol Yisrael Arivim Ze Lazeh, saving hundreds and probably thousands of lives. Thanks to our partnership. And our whole community is established thanks to you. I hope to see you again here. It's time to come visit. We are waiting for you at our Shabbos table. You are the best company to make a lechaim with.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is a true honor and pleasure to be here with you. This morning, I'll interview our dear friend to the Haifa-Boston relationship, to CJP, and also to the Ruderman Family Foundation, חברת הכנסת Michal, the member of Knesset, Michal, which will join us right now shortly. This conversation will divide it to 2. Some background and your personal story, and some of our shared commitment and vision for the relationship between American Jewry, American Jewry, and the world Jewry in general, and the State of Israel. We are so happy and honored to have you with us, Michal.
Thank
you. So with your
you.
permission, we'll jump in. You have such a fascinating story and background. You and your family seem to have a track record of being at the forefront of political affairs. Your mother was parliamentary secretary for Menachem Begin political parties, and I understand that you played piano after school at the home of Menachem and Eliza Begin as a young girl. While waiting for your mother to return from work as a child, Your mother married renowned Canadian lawyer Erwin Cotler, who later became Canada's Justice Minister and was a consul for human rights advocates to Nelson Mandela and Nathan Sharansky. Wow, what a quite interesting story you have. How did growing up in a household like that shape your own worldview?
So first of all, thank you. Thank you, Shira, and thank you. Thank you for the opportunity for being here. Thank you to everybody else who's here to engage in what is such an important topic. And I'm grateful to the words that Marc began with regards to the imperative and the importance of Jewish citizenship that we're talking about here today. I think that that is really in a nutshell, what I was amazingly the beneficiary of in the short sort of story that you told of my own life. Indeed, as a 7-year-old girl, actually, I just relayed this story earlier today. I sat here in the Knesset cafeteria on the night of the Mahapach, what's known as the overturn of the government after many, many years of Mapai, the founding party of this country, and Menachem Begin, in fact, rose to power that night after many years in the opposition. And as a little girl, having been, first of all, like a home away from home, grown up in the corridors of the Knesset, I can tell you that being exposed to the giants of that generation, and certainly on that night, sitting between Esther Raziel Naor and Ben Zion Kishet, giants of Israel's history, and I would say the founding mothers and fathers of this country, I was truly privileged and honored to know people of great humility. And when you ask about Menachem Begin, and I'll say Aliza Begin, Zichra Livracha as well, whose home I had the amazing privilege to indeed play piano in, but also be privy to conversations and to an understanding of the imperative for social mobility that Aliza Begin herself led by engaging mothers to come into housing projects so that their children would have educational opportunities way back in the 70s. Really, the identification as a young girl who didn't know, but the understanding that unity at the end of the day is our foremost responsibility of all of us. And that is what guided that generation's leadership, certainly Menachem Begin's leadership. And you're right, the second sort of part of my journey after those first formative years in the Knesset corridors, my mom married renowned human rights activist, and ultimately, yes, Canada's Justice Minister, but I stress the human rights advocacy piece because that is really what fashioned the continuum of the understanding of the very same human rights that Menachem Begin spoke about. The understanding that it is that commitment to human rights, to everybody's human rights, which shapes and forms our Jewish identity and the identity of this young nascent state at the time, which we were all committed to and are still all committed to. And it's not so old, it's only 72. And here we are as still the founding generation. And that is how I feel in today's Knesset, this founding generation. So whereas those founding mothers and fathers that I had the honor to know lay down the physical infrastructure for this country, for this shared project that we share as Jews all over the world, we now have the tremendous responsibility of laying the second tier. And that is, I would call it the spiritual infrastructure. And that is what my own personal life story has taught me with regards to, of course, international law and Israel standing in the international arena, Israel-diaspora relations, and also Israel's internal resiliency, which is very delicate and, as we know, is experiencing challenges as we head into another election, but which we are all committed to.
I have to say, there are so many things I want to talk to you about and so many questions. And to a certain extent, I'm even so jealous to the fact that you had the opportunity to live in the shadow of, as you said, these giant people, which I think we all miss today, because we want message of unity and we definitely want humility in our leadership, which is something we're all looking forward to. So we're going to try to touch almost every issue that you just mentioned, if we were be lucky. But one more thing about childhood and parents and this influence on your own stories and identity. When it comes to addressing Israel-diaspora relations, a topic I know you care deeply about and we both share very much about, you are uniquely situated You grew up with Israeli and Canadian parents. Your father belonged to a party identified with the Canadian left, and your mother to a party identified with the Israeli right. Added to that, you describe yourself as a liberal modern Orthodox. That's a lot of identities in one person. Has this unique background made it easier to break down some of the traditionally political and religious silos that we often see in Israel and in our Jewish experience?
So thank you for that question. It has not made it easier. It has made my sense of responsibility that much greater. So after my formative years in Israel and then my high school years, well, elementary and high school years in Montreal, I actually came to Israel and served as a lone soldier. Then returning to Canada as a young lawyer, having worked in conjunction with what's known as the Constitutional Revolution in Israel, in the Supreme Court, in the Ministry of Justice, I returned to Canada and actually was there for 10 more years to pursue my master's in law at McGill University. And actually 3 of my 4 children were born in Canada and then emigrated themselves to Israel only a decade ago. And I would say that those multiple identities that you refer to and everything that, you know, I can describe in the back and forth has informed my understanding of the challenges, first and foremost, of immigrants to any country. But beyond that, the challenges of the state of Israel, as I referred to earlier, in its internal understanding or internal resiliency and the challenges that ail us deeply, and certainly its challenges from the outside. So on the global stage, in terms of its legitimacy, its right to exist as what it was founded to be, as what we know it was founded to be according to the Declaration of Independence, that is Jewish and democratic. And when you ask me about that viewpoint diversity and how important it has been, including right here in Knesset, so after many years of serving on boards of organizations like Tzav Pius and being involved in the last 10 years in Israel in the internal resiliency, in Israel diaspora relations, and in the struggle against the delegitimization of Israel in the global arena, what I would say is the viewpoint diversity that we bring with us with our multiple identities, you, Shira, as well. The multiplicity of identities is actually a tremendous strength. And when I talk about the responsibility of our generation, it is first and foremost to acknowledge that it is a strength and not a weakness to be the other, the immigrant, the outsider, because we bring with us something that somebody who may take for granted what they were born into and have known their entire life, we bring perspective. And when we bring that perspective, and I can tell you even from this, you know, last year in Knesset around the 8 committees that I serve on, whether it's foreign relations and security or Aliyah and Klita, or as chair of the drug and alcohol use committee, I can tell you that what we bring with us is the ability to challenge paradigms, the ability to sound viewpoint that is different than somebody who would be coming from the inside, and rather has the perspective of looking at Israel from the outside in. And maybe the one thing I would add to the introduction, and you spoke about the live bridges, which you have been so dramatically and so importantly in the relationship between Israel and diaspora, is that I think our generation's responsibility is to also be translators. And I don't just mean language. I don't just mean English, Hebrew, or any other language that we may need to translate, but it is way beyond that, because we are several generations removed. Whereas my own father remembers the founding of the state of Israel, we are now several generations removed, where it is easy to take for granted that Israel has always been there. And so our voices, while it is not easier to break down some of the traditionally political and religious entrenched silos, it is our imperative to break them down and to engage in conversation in the way that you do with all of the work that you do, and in the way that we must from the Knesset, actually. And the one more thing I would add in this context is the multiplicity of identities actually enables us to identify what I would call the power of moderation that we see all around us in the state of Israel and communities abroad on all the issues that are very challenging to what it means to become a sovereign, actually an indigenous people returning to its ancestral homeland, but becoming a sovereign in that homeland after thousands of years of exile. And those issues, whether it's what it means to be Jewish and democratic, or what it means to be Jewish at all, and what identity looks like in a sovereign country where we are the majority, and what equality looks like according to the principles of the Declaration of Independence that we ensure, and what the relationship between Israel and diaspora looks like now that there is a sovereign state. Those are all the voices of moderation, and we need to sound those voices. And actually, with the power of moderation comes the responsibility of moderates, and the multiplicity of identities enables us to be those translators that I refer to. And so I take that responsibility very, very seriously.
Wow, it is so hard to even, take away from the passion that you bring into, but more importantly, it's the faith that you have in what you represent and how you do that. I think, but what you're saying, which is extremely important to our younger generation, to our own kids, and to the young professionals out there, that number one, the power of personal relationships and the power of, as you said, multiple identities. It is something that we cannot take light. And the opposite, the question is how we bring it in. But in reality, which we're going to dive in with you in a moment, it is not always easy. There are moments that we have to choose and make hard choices. And I'm interested to ask you, before we jump into more political and day-to-day, about the American diaspora relationship, and even more globally, as we have today, the Jewry relationship with the State of Israel. You have spoken about a paradigm shift in the relationship between Israel and the global Jewry. Can you describe your vision, and in particular, the role you believe Israelis and global Jewry need to be taking on?
Absolutely. First of all, it's a question that we are very, very preoccupied with. I think that we need to, as a lawyer, I always say, we first have to define the question. Only then, can we begin with the answers? And we tend to jump into the answers, and the cacophony of voices often sort of drowns out where we began and what the question actually is. So thank you for that very important question. Actually, when I formed the subcommittee on Israel diaspora relations, part of the paradigm shift was in the way that I created the discussions that we had at the committee. So what was important to me was actually that Knesset members and that the committee and that the Knesset itself hear rather than speak, right? So that engagement began with student activists combating anti-Semitism on campuses across the United States. It continued with listening to the Jewish community of Bahrain, who all of a sudden was brought into the fold after 140 years of complete disconnect and the inability to engage with Israel in any way, shape, or form, and continued with JNS's top 40 advocates for the Jewish state, but they bring with them the voices that link or that bridge or that translate Israel's challenges in the international arena. And all those voices, to me, were very important to be brought into Knesset. So we don't come up with a solution, with the answer, before we've identified the questions. And when I talk about, or you ask me about the vision for what that engagement looks like, look, we had a shared project. It was to build the physical infrastructure for the state of Israel, and we succeeded. We have built a state. And in many ways, the imperative to renew our shared project and renew the covenant between us around this shared project, and even ask the question, is this still our shared project? What does it mean that this is our shared project? What does it look like to engage diaspora and for Israel and diaspora to actually listen to each other? And there's that story about the rabbi who says to his students, you say you love me, but do you know what hurts me? Because if you don't know what hurts me, you do not love me. And in many ways, we have sort of drowned each other out in discussions of presumption, of knowing what works for diaspora from Israel and for knowing what works for Israel from diaspora. And to truly engage in this discussion, we have to bring the voices of that engagement, in my view, to the decision makers certainly around Israel's table. And part of the paradigm shift, I think at 72 for the state of Israel, is that it is no longer just the center for Jews around the world, it's also the center for Judaism. And in that, I think that the balance has shifted because Marc mentioned the late Rabbi Hartman, and I was the beneficiary of the education that Rabbi Hartman founded in Montreal. My own children attended the school that he built for his children. And his understanding of pluralism enabled the multiplicity of voices that we referred to coexist, even if they if they disagreed, but they coexisted in most of the time in harmony, sometimes in disharmony, and they still coexisted. The balance has shifted, and those voices now have to be, or I would say the responsibility falls on the state of Israel to create that ability of engagement with diaspora Jewry. Of course, beyond North America, there's additional communities all over the world, but certainly with where the majority of Jews outside of Israel today reside. And it is that responsibility, that paradigm shift that looks at the engagement in a completely different way, that I believe has to guide us in the current challenges which we face. And, we mentioned COVID-19 sort of flippantly or, lightly, but COVID-19 is actually the tremendous opportunity alongside the challenges that it brings. It has shown a huge light on all that ails our structures, our systems, our countries, probably, in personal lives and communal lives as well. And that is, if there is anything I, want to highlight, is that COVID-19 has to be looked at as the opportunity. When we discuss around the Aliyah Klita Committee, the perspective relationship or the paradigm shift I refer to with diaspora, but also the prospect of 250,000 new immigrants, Olim, to the state of Israel. They will only come if we identify and remove the hurdles that exist right now. And to do that, we need to create this discourse to understand what it is, to know what hurts us, to understand what it is that hurts us, because only then can we say that we love each other, that we are arevim ze laze, that mutual guarantee that is so important and so fundamental. And actually, we just read, a few weeks ago, we read Yitro, Parashat Yitro, and it's Yitro that actually brought the notion of arvut adadit to its fullest, in that we become a nation of leaders. We don't have one leader. We're that responsibility is each one of ours. If you ask me what I learned from my own formative years, my childhood years, or living in a house where Natan Sharansky was our responsibility, as was Nelson Mandela, as were the Tutsis and Hutus and excuse me, but human rights struggles of our generation. That means that we all have that responsibility. It is not someone else. There is no other person. We all have that responsibility to engage in this way, and that's part of the paradigm shift.
What can I say other than it is amazing to hear what you say, because this paradigm shift is something truly significant that impact everyone and every organization's work, right? We spoke about, you just mentioned, and when I say we, the Ruderman Family Foundation, we write about exactly the same issue that says we had a joint goal to create the state of Israel. And now that we have very strong Jewish communities, one in Israel and one, and I'm gonna zoom into the American Jewish community for this conversation, with your permission, very successful Jewish community. And in terms of numbers, we are just about the same. Yes, we can argue. There are 3 philosophies of how we count the numbers, but it's just about the same. So let's dive into this issue, because here we are, 2 successful communities, although I just for this conversation use Israel as a community. I do not see Israel as a community, it's a state. And as a state, it is a bit more complex. But you mentioned something that is very important. Israel has 2 roles. One, a state and a country for all of its citizens. This is the internal, as you said, dynamic resiliency and domestic issues. And another is a homeland for Jewish people all around the world. I think, and I would like to hear more from you about, we understand, all of us, what does it mean a home for its citizens? And we have a government and a system, unfortunately not as stable as we wish, but it exists. But I don't think we have the deep understanding today as we had 72 years ago. What does it mean to be the homeland of the Jewish people? So please tell me a little bit, how do you see this role? How can we organize and create a vision for the next 72 years so we as Jewish people around the world can come together for what unites us versus what separates between us?
So first of all, again, this is probably the most important question, and some of it Some of it actually demands, I call it, I guess as a Canadian, truth and reconciliation, right? When we launched this shared project, everybody was supposed to come here. That was the deal. We'll build a state and everybody will come to the country, right? That was what Ben-Gurion expected. He thought we would settle, not Stum, he really thought we would settle the Negev. He really thought we would settle every piece of territory that was ours. And that understanding didn't materialize, right? That vision, or what he thought of, or the founding mothers and fathers of this country thought of, didn't materialize physically. It materialized in other ways. It materialized spiritually. And that is a huge challenge that we haven't talked about yet, right? When you talk about truth and reconciliation, sometimes it's really good to say, look, these were the expectations. This is what was in the minds of the founding mothers and fathers of this country. And as we grow apart, so that first generation that was committed to the state of Israel physically came to fight and was physically and grew to the second generation that was maybe dedicated differently. And now we are at the next or third or fourth generations that are connected to how. And that spiritual connection is the how. That is the discussion that we are talking, engaging, deepening our sort of questions that need to be asked, what it looks like. And you were right. Israel, sort of conducts itself as one state of its citizens with its own share of troubles. And the second, a center for the Jewish people, for Jewish peoplehood, for the development of identity, no matter where Jews live in the world, certainly in the United States or in North America generally. And just one more thing I'll say about that in terms of the historic opportunity that I think that we're in, because sometimes it can get overwhelming. And I like to remind that we are only 72 years old, and this is a work in progress. And so long as we renew the covenant to that shared commitment and continue the engagement, no matter what, continue the engagement, even if it means truth and reconciliation hurts a little bit, even if it means we may have been disappointed or hurt, and even if it means if we grew away from the original shared project, so long as we keep those lines of communication open, it's truly our, I'd say, historic opportunity to advance the conversation for the next 72 years. And what's been challenging in Knesset, and I'll say one more word about that maybe. What's been challenging in Knesset is that these voices aren't, I would say, prevalent or common in Israel's Knesset, because the focus naturally, as in all other countries, are on the internal issues, are on the internal resiliency, are on, the challenges that ail us internally. There have to be members of Knesset that are those bridges, that are those translators. And if there is anything that and I'm not running in the upcoming election, but that I leave this Knesset with, is the resolve to return because of that, is the resolve to create the understanding that actually Olim, new immigrants, and it doesn't matter how long you've been here, because Olim is probably a misnomer. It's anybody that understands Israel from the outside in, as opposed to just from the inside out. And if they understand both, then they can really be the translators. So we can sometimes be the second generation or generation and a half, the children of Olim, that are able to be those voices around the table. We cannot be satisfied with contributing and making an impact to Israeli society in every other way. If you look at entrepreneurship and philanthropy and business and education and medicine and law and every other way, we cannot be satisfied with all of that. We need to lean in and actually take our rightful place around the decision-making tables, because our voices are critical to being able to be that live bridge you spoke about, those translators you spoke about, so that we can continue this engagement, so that we sound the authentic voices inside the Knesset, so decision makers are exposed and policy makers are exposed to those voices and are able to consider them, to understand them as they make decisions that affect not only Israel internally, but as you said, that additional second half of our peoplehood that are across the ocean.
So you mentioned you're not running, and we're going to get to it in a moment, because we need you as a bridge and beyond. But one more question about this issue, and then we'll move on. You know, you said recently the voice of diaspora must be heard around the decision-making table, you know, to engage with Knesset members. You also mentioned the different bridges, opportunities, like the Israeli community outside of Israel is a bridge. The Olim in Israel are a bridge, like yourself, like me. We both represent that. You know, while we speak, I'm sitting here in the United States, you sit in Israel, and here we are. And recently, Minister of Diaspora, Marian Kelevich, and you supported it, suggested to give a voice to American Jewry, or to the world Jewry, more particular, around the table and decision-making. And I am curious to ask you, do you think diaspora Jews should have a say in Israeli policy? And if so, how can we make it work? Considering, I'll just add, I'm sorry, that American Jewry or world Jewry is not one voice.
So you said I supported it. I support it in principle. I don't support this model of it. I don't think legislation is the way, actually. I don't think that legislating, and exactly because of what you just said, legislating a certain issue, it's not just the one voice, Shira. I would dare argue that we would never be able to say which subjects affect diaspora Jewry, right? The initial understanding was on issues that affect diaspora Jewry. Every issue that policymakers decide on in the state of Israel, when policymakers decide that we have to wage war, that affects diaspora Jewry. I know that very, very well. And on the other hand, we can't let external voices affect whether we wage war or not, whether we need to, you know, launch a military operation or not. We just can't, because there is no way for not because we think for a second that diaspora Jewry doesn't care, but there's no way to comprehend the complexity of the issues from the inside, much less looking from the outside in. So in many ways, when I say that the Olim are the bridges, or again, Israelis living abroad are the bridges, and that the importance of this engagement in making the decision makers aware of the implications for the other communities, it doesn't necessarily mean, and I say this as a lawyer, that the law is the vehicle for that kind of change. I actually believe very much in, you know, Amanat Gabizon Meidan, the Gabizon Meidan covenant was a covenant. It wasn't a law. And the reason that it could work is that it has the malleability, the flexibility, although sadly it wasn't actually championed in the way that it should be. And that is what we need to launch still today, you know, the continuum of the Gabizon Meidan covenant with regards to what Jewish and democratic looks like in Israel, for those that might not know. It isn't a law intentionally. It isn't a law because a law actually undermines the ability for the flexibility and the fluidity of what it is that we want to consider. And the multiplicity of voices that we referred to at the beginning of the conversation would actually be lost if we created one or two, I don't know how we would choose them, voices on one or two or 5 or 10 issues, and we would lose the ability for a deeper engagement. So while I support the idea, I believe that first we need to launch the process to understand how it is that we have that representation. And we have, of course, we have the Zionist institutions, and we have multiple organizations that maybe are the vehicles for this. I'm not sure if the right thing to do is legislate in Knesset the ability for diaspora Jewry to vote on certain internal issues. I would argue not, but even if we were to arrive at that conclusion, it would have to be at the end of a process rather than the launch of a process of engagement.
So we have to wrap it up, and I would ask you 2 questions to end it, if it's okay. One is, there's so much more work to do, and I'm curious, and I'm sure many others, why you made the decision not to run. As we both know, we need good people like yourself. So this is one personal aspect, and more to our audience, if you can say, what can they do? And what American Jewry can do to strengthen the relationship, to support social justice and strong democratic country, so they keep, you know, the engagement, the faith, the vision that we both share.
Okay, so for the first, I'm not running because there was no political platform. So, I mean, it's, you know, a crazy political time in Israel, and we're in flux, and hopefully, I'd say a work in progress for sure. I entered the Knesset with blue and white and announced I would not be running with blue and white, because actually a lot of the ideas that we spoke about today are so important to me. And sadly for me, the execution of those ideas failed. And the understanding that the voices that I represent, that I've been honored, and I have to say a complete honor and privilege and responsibility to represent these voices, are not yet understood as imperative around the decision-making tables. And so really, there was no, in the outgoing Knesset, no platform that I had a spot on, that I had the ability to run with in a relevant position of impact. And so the decision has been that I will continue to sound and represent these voices from additional platforms outside of the Knesset in order to be able to return in a much more effective way. In a way that will have much more impact, in a way that will be able to represent these voices in the way that they deserve. Because when I talk about the empowerment of the voices that I've been honored to represent, whether it's actually not just Olim, as I said over and over again, many, many Israeli voices that understand that it is imperative that we empower the voices of moderation, that we enable inclusion, that we actually, in order to be able to understand good governance and transparency and long-term processes, and I could be talking about anything, education, COVID-19, healthcare, crime and domestic violence, inclusion of people with handicaps. I could be talking about absolutely everything. Our understanding, having come from seasoned democracies and having come with Jewish identities that coexist with democracy in harmony, is very, very important. And so I do intend to continue sounding and representing and hopefully coming back to the Knesset in an effective way. That's on that. And the second piece that I think is really important to note for all of us in this continued engagement, beyond the fact that we are a work in progress and we are still the founding generation of the State of Israel as we know it, that it is our generation's responsibility to lean in and build that second tier of spiritual infrastructure, as we called it. I'd say we're living at a historic time. You know, we didn't mention the Abraham Accords and the incredible opportunity for what's happened in my understanding with the Abraham Accords in the shift from rejectionism to normalization in shelves full of books called the Arab-Israeli conflict that potentially is no longer. That potential paradigm shift was enabled by a transition or a pivot away from what we know of as the three no's at the time of Khartoum in 1967, no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, and ultimately no to peace with Israel, to the three yeses. Yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, yes to peace, in that order. And where I think that it's important that North American Jewry and American Jewry be involved in that is highlighting the fact that that order is important because the recognition of the State of Israel as what it is, namely Jewish and democratic, is an answer to a lot of what challenges us on many, many levels, whether it's combating anti-Semitism on or offline, because you have the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism, which is directly connected to recognition. And by the way, IRA was adopted by Bahrain and by Morocco, not officially, but adopted in that sense of deep recognition of Israel's right to exist as what it is, Jewish and democratic. So it also addresses the challenges or identity challenges that North American, certainly students experience on campus and what it means. You know, do I have to choose between being a Zionist and being a Jew on campus? And can those identities coexist? And it also empowers us with the understanding that what has happened externally, recognition being the first step that enables negotiation and peace, can also be reflected and turned inwards to the State of Israel. So the recognition of the other enables the negotiation, which ultimately leads to peace, but also the relationship between Israel and diaspora. The recognition of the other, and if I go back to, if you don't know what hurts me, how can you say you love me? The recognition of the other's needs and rights to exist as who we are, enables that kind of hidavut or negotiation, which ultimately can create that sense of peace in our coexistence as a people as well. And the most important thing that I would say, and Marc quoted the late Rabbi Hartman, and I would be remiss if I didn't quote the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks on this, is that I'm very hopeful. And Rabbi Sacks differentiated between optimism and hope in the following way. He said, optimism is the belief that everything is going to be okay, but hope is the belief that we have to make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, whereas hope is a very active one. And it takes no courage at all to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to be hopeful. And so it's these kind of engagements that not only fill me with hope, but that I hope enable a continued conversation that will in fact be that active, hopeful, and as a people whose anthem is Hatikva, the hope, and it takes courage. It takes courage, and it is the responsibility of our generation. So don't shy away from it, and don't shy away from the engagement. And for anybody who's listening to us out there, I know the challenges that are faced, whether it's on campus or in communities or in workplaces, or with the politicization of what we understand as our shared values. It is imperative that we go back to those shared values, not just as a Jewish community, but in U.S.-Israel relations. Those shared values and that bipartisan understanding of those shared values. Again, when we talk about bridges and translators, that is what you are. And so Israel needs your voices as you need Israel's voices on multiple levels. And it is that engagement that will enable us as a people, we started with Jewish peoplehood, enable us as a people to create the vision, the mission, and the values that not only are based on the past, but create the next 72 years of our continued existence.
Amazing, Michal. You said it so well. I want to thank you for your commitment, for your friendship, for your vision, for the hard work. And I want to tell you that here in CJP, in Haifa, Boston relationship, you always have partners to work with. And we have no doubt that you'll come back, if through the Knesset or in other opportunities, and we will work side by side to make what you said come true. So I want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. There are so many subjects we could cover, and it's not enough time, but we'll continue with you in other opportunities. So the power of personal relationship and peoplehood, I think there is no better example than the Haifa-Boston relationship, which is such an amazing example for so many other communities. And I want to use this opportunity to pass the conversation to the chair of the Haifa-Boston relationship, Gadi Ziv. And thank you so much all for continuing with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Shira. I'm thrilled to take part of this virtual CJP Global Jewish Citizenship Summit. Yes, I really preferred the March meetings we had in the previous year. Face-to-face in Haifa, I miss the side talks, the hugs. But this year, the Kabbalat Shabbat, the BH Cafe, and many other virtual meetings proved how strong and deep our connection is. My name is Gadi Ziv, and I'm the chair of Haifa-Boston Connection in Haifa. Haifa is my hometown for the last 40 years. I came to study in the Technion, but fell in love with the city and with my Haifaite wife. After many years in the high-tech industry, I retired and decided to find meaningful volunteering opportunity. I found that Haifa-Boston organization is totally aligned with the values I care about. Two of my children volunteered before the army as Shnat Sherut, or service volunteering year before the army, in which they worked with the Ethiopian community. My daughter continued after the army service and volunteered in the city of Gundar in Ethiopia as a Hebrew teacher. So following their footsteps, kids used to follow their parents' footsteps, but we are in the 21st century, so parents follow the kids' footstep, it seems to be the right path for me too. Later, I learned about other Haifa Boston projects, Parrots at the Center, and what we now call Peoplehood, and found that Haifa Boston matches my value even more. Haifa Boston connection brings unique value to the city of Haifa. The partnership between volunteers and staff from both cities brings an innovative thinking that produce amazing programs that couldn't happen if we haven't had this people and communities partnership. At the end, we contribute to the community and get contributed by the wonderful relationships that we build throughout the years. I want to thank Rabbi Marc Baker, President and CEO of CJP, and Rabbi Kamenetsky for the remarks today, and special thanks to Chavrat HaKnesset Michal Cotler-Wunsh for being with us today. Please join us tomorrow to hear Dr. Manfred Grimm, Professor of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health in the University of Haifa, former head of the Public Health branch of the IDF, and founding director of the Israeli Center for Disease Control. See you all tomorrow and enjoy the rest of the day and the evening. Thank you.